Well, what an interesting series this was. Bodies has recently landed on Netflix, and this was a show that was focused on the same murder case that occurred in 4 different time periods: 1890, 1941, 2023, and 2053. With time travel being at the core of it, I thought I'd break down and discuss the ending along with explaining the timeline and how the loop was eventually broken. So let's get into it. Here is Bodies Ending and Timeline Explained. Just to let you know, this video will contain spoilers. So this show was essentially focused around one man's selfishness in order to gain a life of love that he was deprived of as a child, and with the possibility of time travel, he went back in time and became his own ancestor, causing the world to be in a constant time loop. This loop of time that was created meant that it came at the expense of around 500,000 people in London, as they all suffered a death from an explosion that was caused. These were all events that had to go ahead in order for the initial travelling back in time to be possible in 2053. So let's start in the present day and work our way back to the beginning. 2023. Within 2023, we saw the body of Defoe that was lying there, which was found by Shahara Hassan. This is the timeline where Elias was a teenager, and he'd been in and out of care for the most part of his life, feeling abandoned and like he'd never truly felt love. Something which caused him to have a sense of hatred in the world and a resentment towards others. This is essentially the end of the timeline, because right at the end, when the unraveling started to occur, Elias basically ceased to exist. This is because when the bomb eventually never goes off in 2023, Elias doesn't become the commander of the New Order. He doesn't go back with the time travel that's there, and he doesn't adopt the identity of Sir Julian Harker, becoming himself, which starts over the cycle again and creates the ancestors for him to be born. 2053. 2053 is the end of the linear timeline, but the middle of the loop, and this is where we saw Iris Maplewood find the 4th and penultimate body. She went on to find a 5th because we learned that the type of time travel which was created, when going through the throat, it essentially enabled an individual to go forwards as well as backwards after they split into different times. This was something called temporal displacement. So because Defoe entered the throat in the year 2053, as well as going back in time, it meant that he would also arrive around 4 days later in that current time period. This was where we essentially saw Elias Mannix go back in time utilizing the throat and start the process of creating his doomsday cult, which would basically allow him to change the course of his life and ensure that the doomsday occurred on the 14th of July 2023. If he was stopped, then he'd cease to exist at all. This was the timeline where we also found out why Defoe's body was found on Long Harvest Lane across all 4 timelines and who was responsible for it. The person responsible for the murder was Iris. Iris fired her weapon at Gabriel before he entered the throat, and it wounded him there. Hence why there was no bullet in the timelines in the past, because it didn't go through the throat with him and was on the ground in 2053. 1890. Despite 1890 being the earliest point in the timeline, it's actually the 3rd touch point that we have, and it's where Elias Mannix started to lay down the foundation of the events that would eventually occur. This was where Elias took on the form of Sir Julian Harker and essentially became his own great-great-grandfather. This was where the Doomsday Cult was formed, and everybody that was close to him started devising the plan which would create the bomb that would go off in 2023. This is the timeline where the love that Elias desired was first formed, and the first time he experienced it. This is due to him falling in love with Polly, Inspector Alfred Hillingden's daughter. However, this is the timeline where in the end, it causes the unraveling to occur and for the loop to be broken. This is because Iris went to 1890 from 2053 and spoke to Hillingden and revealed Julian Harker's true identity to him. Knowing this information, before Alfred was killed, he called Julian Harker by his real name, Elias. This in turn caused the ripple effect for him to act differently towards Polly due to the shock that he had, and he even admitted that he was responsible for her father's death. This meant that the loop went out of sync and different events occurred, something which rippled into 1941. 1941. This was the timeline that was the most action-filled. This is where we saw a 99-year-old Julian Harker recording the messages for everybody to find in 2023. Most importantly, the one which Elias was listening to before detonating the bomb, which went on to cause 500,000 people to die and the New Order to eventually be formed. In the original loop, Polly went on to live a happy life with Elias, or Sir Julian Harker, and she was the person who was behind ensuring that certain events happened with Charles Whiteman, and even the killing of Esther, causing him to want to seek revenge on Polly and also Elias, marking the end of Elias's life. But the loop would continue on back in 2023 when the records were found, as the 2023 Elias was born through his great-grandchild Danny Barber. However, following Iris's disruption in the previous timeline, it meant that Polly went on to live a life where she was extremely unhappy with Julian, and this also rubbed off on him, meaning that the love that he so desired from people never really existed, and he regretted the slaughtering of all of those innocent people for his own selfish gain. Following the disruption, we saw him record a different message for Elias in 2023, where he told him that every record that he had ever recorded and listened to was a lie, and that he shouldn't detonate the bomb. This was something which was found in 2023 due to Charles Whiteman giving Julian a chance when he entered the room, and instead left it in the copper's pub. This meant that the Shahara in 2053 utilized the throat, went back to 2023 before the explosion happened, and found the record, played it to Elias, and we saw that he didn't detonate it, meaning that Elias ceased to exist because he couldn't go back in time and start the chain. We saw that it even impacted everybody else in their present day, as they lived out that first day in a completely different way, showing that Esther was still alive in the 40s, Henry and Alfred never really went on to know each other in the 1890s, and Shahara went back to deal with the march that was taking place in the first episode. The final thing that we saw was Iris in the 2023 timeline, driving a cab, which had picked up Shahara and she knew her name. However, Shahara didn't know Iris's, showing that some events of the future could have caused her to have gone back to 2023 and maybe even be setting up a season 2 of the show. It's a very complicated timeline to get your head around, and it's one that does take some thinking to understand how it fully works, but it's actually very well pieced together and quite smart. Overall review. I actually really enjoyed this show. I think it's going to be one that proves to be a bit divisive, but for what it is, I think it works. It doesn't try to be too clever, and it keeps a loop that's relatively easy to understand once you get your head around it. Even though this show was only 8 episodes, I'd describe it as a long 8 episodes. Most of them were on the cusp of an hour, and with a heavy topic like this, it can feel quite heavy at points, but it didn't take anything away from the enjoyment factor. I loved that we got several different time periods in the show. I'm a sucker for something set in the past, and this scratched that itch perfectly. I don't think I could fault the cast in any way at all. Stephen Graham was great as per usual. I'm just used to hearing him with a Scouse accent, so it was very different, but it sounded convincing. I would say that I liked the 1890s or the 1941 timeline the most. It was just great getting an insight into that time and seeing just how different it was to the modern day and futuristic timeline. As much as I enjoyed the show, I hope it doesn't get a season 2. It doesn't need one. It works so well on its own. It would just be too repetitive if it is, and I might even start to feel like I'm in a loop, but I guess time will tell with that. This was definitely worth a watch, and I'd 100% recommend. So, there you have it. Bodies, timeline and ending explained.